The stars were quiet that night when the signal came through. Lieutenant Price sat at her station aboard the USS Valiant, monitoring the usual background noise of deep space. She had been doing this job for 3 years and had grown used to the emptiness between worlds. Most nights brought nothing but static and the distant echoes of dying stars. But this night was different. A sound cut through the silence. It was faint at first, barely a whisper against the void. Leaned forward in her chair and adjusted her equipment. The sound grew stronger. It was not random noise. It was a pattern. Someone out there was calling for help. She worked quickly to clean up the signal and run it through her translation software. The computer struggled with the language because it was not in any database the human fleet possessed. This was something new. This was first contact with an unknown species. Press the communication button on her console. Her voice was steady but urgent when she spoke. She told Captain Cole that he needed to come to the bridge immediately. She had found something important. Captain Cole arrived within minutes. He was a tall man with gray hair at his temples and eyes that had seen too many battles. He stood beside and listened as she played the signal for him. The sounds were strange and musical, rising and falling like waves on a shore. Even without understanding the words, both of them could hear the fear in that voice. The translation software finally produced a rough version of the message. It was a distress call from a species called the. There was under attack. They were dying. They begged anyone who could hear them to send help. They said they had tried every other power in the galaxy and been refused. They had heard stories about the humans from Earth. They had heard that humans came from a death world where everything tried to kill them. They hoped that maybe such a species would be brave enough to fight. Captain Cole read the translation twice. Then he ordered to send the signal to Admiral on the command deck. This decision was above his rank. Only the Admiral could authorize a response to something like this. Admiral was 52 years old and had spent 30 of those years serving in the fleet. She had commanded ships in 3 different wars and had never lost a vessel under her direct control. Her crew called her the Iron Lady behind her back, though they meant it with respect. When she received the distress call, she gathered her senior officers in the conference room. Commander Daniel Brooks was the first to speak. He was the tactical officer of the Valiant and had a reputation for being both brilliant and reckless. He told the Admiral that responding to this signal would be dangerous. They knew nothing about the. They knew even less about the enemy attacking them. The message mentioned something called the swarm, but human records had no information about such a species. Doctor spoke next. She was the chief medical officer and also served as the fleet's. She said that the swarm sounded like a hive mind species based on the little information in the message. Hive minds were rare and extremely dangerous. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They consumed everything in their path. Chief Engineer Samuel Turner leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. He was a practical man who cared more about keeping ships running than politics or glory. He pointed out that the fleet was far from home and low on certain supplies. If they went to help they would be fighting on empty stomachs with no backup coming. Admiral listened to all of them without interrupting. When they finished, she stood and walked to the window that looked out into space. The stars stared back at her like a million cold eyes. She thought about what it meant to be human. She thought about all the times in history when her species had faced extinction and survived. She thought about the oath she had taken when she joined the fleet. She turned back to her officers and gave her decision. They would answer the distress call. They would go to space and they would fight. She told them that if they did nothing and the swarm destroyed humanity could be next. There was no one else coming to help. There was only them. Commander Brooks asked how they were supposed to fight an enemy they had never seen. Admiral smiled for the first time that day. She told him that humans had been fighting unknown enemies since they first crawled out of caves and learned to hold weapons. They would study the enemy when they arrived. They would find weaknesses. They would adapt. That was what humans did. The orders went out across the fleet within the hour. 18 ships of the first expeditionary fleet changed course and burned hard toward space. Crew members who had been sleeping woke to alarms and briefings. Word spread quickly about what was happening. They were going to war against something terrible to save a species they had never met. Price returned to her station and continued working on the language. She wanted to be able to communicate with them when they arrived. She wanted to tell them that help was coming. She worked through the night without rest, driven by a feeling she could not name. It was something between excitement and fear. Captain Cole walked the corridors of the Valiant and spoke with his crew. He told them to prepare for the hardest fight of their lives. He told them that he was proud to serve with each of them. He told them that whatever happened next, they would face it together. In her quarters, Admiral recorded a message for Fleet Command back on Earth. She explained her decision and accepted full responsibility for whatever came next. She did not know if she was leading her people to victory or death. She only knew that she could not ignore a call for help. That was not who she was. That was not who humanity was. The fleet traveled for 6 days through empty space. 6 days of preparation and worry and hope. And at the end of those 6 days, they saw space for the first time. They saw the distant glow of an alien sun and the planets that orbited it. They saw the first ships coming to meet them. The battle for survival was about to begin. The first ship approached the human fleet slowly. It was a beautiful vessel, curved and elegant like something grown rather than built. The hull shimmered with colors that shifted between blue and silver as it moved through space. Admiral watched it from the bridge of the Valiant and felt a strange mix of wonder and sadness. This was first contact with a new species, something humanity had dreamed about for centuries, but it was happening because that species was dying. Lieutenant Price opened a communication channel using the translation protocol she had worked on during the journey. Her voice carried across the void, offering greetings and friendship. The response came back moments later. A voice filled the bridge, alien and musical, speaking words that the computer turned into something humans could understand. The voice belonged to Ambassador of the Confederacy. The ambassador thanked the humans for answering their call. The words carried exhaustion and desperate hope, requested permission to board the human flagship and speak with the fleet commander directly. Admiral granted the request immediately. The shuttle docked with the Valiant an hour later. Admiral assembled a greeting party in the landing bay. Captain Cole stood at her right side. Commander Brooks stood at her left. Doctor waited nearby with medical equipment in case the aliens had different atmospheric needs. Chief Engineer Turner watched from the back, curious despite his practical nature. The shuttle door opened and 2 figures emerged. The humans got their first look at and tried not to stare. The aliens were tall and thin, standing almost 7 feet high. Their skin was pale lavender and seemed to glow faintly from within. They had 4 arms and large dark eyes that reflected the light like pools of water. Their movements were graceful and slow, as if they were dancing through the air. Ambassador stepped forward first. Beside the ambassador walked military liaison, wearing something that looked like ceremonial armor. Both aliens stopped when they got close to the humans. Their large eyes widened even further. They looked at the human delegation with expressions that could only be described as fear. Admiral noticed their reaction and kept her voice gentle when she spoke. She welcomed them aboard and expressed her sorrow for what was happening to their world. She assured them that humanity had come to help. Struggled to respond. The ambassador explained that they had heard many stories about humans but had never believed them. They had heard that Earth was a death world, a planet of extreme violence where everything fought to survive. They had heard that humans were predators who could run for days without stopping and heal from wounds that would kill other species. They had heard that humans came from a place with crushing gravity and a poisonous atmosphere full of a corrosive gas called oxygen. Commander Brooks could not help but smile at that last part. He told the ambassador that humans called that corrosive gas the air they breathed. He said it was actually quite pleasant once you got used to it. They did not seem to find this funny. asked how any intelligent species could evolve on such a hostile world. The question was not an insult, it was genuine confusion. Doctor answered with the patience of a teacher. She explained that humans evolved on Earth over millions of years. Their ancestors survived ice ages and volcanic eruptions and mass extinctions. They learned to hunt animals larger and faster than themselves by chasing them until the animals collapsed from exhaustion. They adapted to every environment on their planet, from frozen wastelands to burning deserts to dense jungles filled with venomous creatures. They listened with growing disbelief, asked if it was true that humans felt pain and kept fighting anyway. Doctor confirmed this. She said that humans had a concept called adrenaline that allowed them to ignore severe injuries during moments of crisis. She mentioned that human soldiers had been known to continue fighting after losing limbs. Made a sound that might have been a gasp. The military liaison said that soldiers would go into shock from such trauma and become unable to function. The idea that a species could keep fighting through that kind of damage was terrifying. Admiral decided to move the conversation forward. She invited them to the conference room where they could discuss the situation in detail. The group walked through the corridors of the Valiant. They flinched at the sound of human footsteps, which seemed loud and heavy compared to their own quiet movements. In the conference room, shared everything they knew about the swarm. The information was grim. The swarm was a hive-mind species that had consumed 7 civilizations over the past 1,000 years. They traveled in living vessels that grew and reproduced like organisms. Their numbers were estimated in the tens of thousands. They did not communicate or negotiate. They simply devoured everything in their path. The swarm had already destroyed 3 colony worlds, billions of lives lost. The fleet had tried to fight back but suffered devastating losses. They had perhaps 2 weeks before the swarm reached there. When that happened, 14 billion would die. Admiral asked what weapons were effective against the swarm. Gave a bitter answer. Nothing was effective. They could regenerate damage faster than weapons could inflict it. The swarm adapted to new tactics within hours. Every species that had tried to fight them had failed. Commander Brooks leaned forward with interest in his eyes. He asked about the command structure of the swarm. How did they coordinate so many ships? There had to be some form of central control. Confirmed that the swarm operated through command nodes, specialized that directed clusters of lesser vessels. Destroying a command node would disrupt part of the swarm temporarily. But the central consciousness, a massive at the heart of the fleet, would simply create new nodes to replace them. Brooks smiled in a way that made them nervous. He told Admiral that he had an idea. If they could strike fast enough, they might be able to take out multiple command nodes before the central consciousness could adapt. Then they could hit the central consciousness itself. Protested that such a plan was suicide. No ship had ever gotten close to the central consciousness and survived. Admiral looked at the ambassador with calm confidence. She said that no ship that had tried was crewed by humans. She told them that her people had a long history of doing impossible things when survival was at stake. The meeting ended with an agreement to combine forces. The remaining ships would integrate with the human fleet. They would plan together and fight together. They left the Valiant still frightened of their new allies, but for the first time in months, they also felt something else. They felt hope. The days that followed were filled with desperate work. Every person in the human fleet knew that time was running out. The swarm was coming and nothing would stop it unless they found a way. Admiral gave orders that sleep was optional and effort was mandatory. Her crew did not complain. They understood what was at stake. Chief Engineer Samuel Turner worked around the clock in the engine rooms and maintenance bays. They had shared information about swarm weapons. They used acidic projectiles that could eat through standard hull plating within minutes. Turner needed to find a way to protect the fleet from this threat. He gathered his engineering teams and explained the problem. They needed armor that could resist acid. They needed it installed on every ship. They needed it done in less than 2 weeks. His people looked at him like he was crazy. Then they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. The solution came from an unexpected place. One of the younger engineers, a woman named Lisa Park, remembered reading about specialized coatings used on Earth for chemical processing plants. She suggested they could modify the formula and apply it to hull plating. Turner told her to start working on it immediately. For 3 days straight, the engineering teams manufactured and tested the new coating. They failed again and again. Each failure taught them something new. On the 4th day, they finally created a version that could withstand swarm acid for extended periods. Turner smiled for the first time since the mission began. He ordered the coating applied to every ship in the fleet. While the engineers worked on defense, Commander Daniel Brooks focused on offense. He spent hours studying the data that had provided about swarm tactics and behavior. He watched recordings of previous battles where ships had been destroyed. He analyzed every movement the swarm made. A pattern began to emerge. The command nodes always positioned themselves at specific distances from the central consciousness. They moved in formation, never straying too far from each other. This meant they were predictable. Predictable enemies could be ambushed. Brooks developed a strike plan using fast attack craft. Human destroyers were smaller and more agile than the main battleships. They could slip through gaps in the swarm formation and hit command nodes before the enemy could react. It was dangerous work. The pilots would be flying into the heart of enemy territory with minimal support, but Brooks had seen human pilots do incredible things before. He presented his plan to Captain Cole, who would lead the strike force personally. Cole listened carefully and asked questions about escape routes and backup options. Brooks admitted that escape routes were limited and backup would be far away. Cole nodded slowly and said he would do it anyway. Some things were worth the risk. Lieutenant Price had her own mission during these preparations. She continued working on communications, trying to understand how the hive mind coordinated its forces. The signals were complex and layered, like 1,000 voices speaking at once, but was patient and skilled. After 5 days of analysis, she made a breakthrough. The command nodes broadcast on specific frequencies that were slightly different from the general swarm chatter. She could identify these frequencies and track them. This meant the strike teams would know exactly where to find their targets. She brought her findings to Admiral immediately. The Admiral praised her work and ordered the information distributed to all ship commanders. Felt a surge of pride. Her contribution might save lives. Doctor prepared the medical bays for mass casualties. She requisitioned every medical supply the fleet carried and set up triage stations throughout the ship. She trained additional crew members in basic first aid because she knew her regular staff would be overwhelmed during the battle. She also studied physiology in case their allies needed medical attention. They were fragile compared to humans. Their bones were hollow like birds and their organs were delicate. Injuries that a human could survive might kill instantly. Made notes and prepared specialized treatment protocols. They watched all of this activity with amazement. They had never seen a species prepare for war with such intensity. Visited the Valiant daily to coordinate with human commanders, and each visit left the military liaison more impressed. One afternoon, found a group of human Marines training in the cargo bay. They were practicing hand-to-hand combat, throwing each other across the room and landing with heavy thuds. Asked what they were doing. A Marine sergeant named Hart explained that they were preparing for boarding actions. If the strike against command nodes did not work, they might need to enter the central consciousness and destroy it from inside. That meant fighting through a living ship filled with hostile creatures. Asked if the humans truly believed they could survive inside a swarm. Sergeant Hart shrugged and said they would find out. He added that humans had walked on the surface of airless moons and swum to the bottom of crushing ocean depths. A living ship was just another hostile environment. They had no response to that. They simply did not understand how any species could be so casual about facing death. Admiral held a final briefing the night before the swarm was expected to arrive. All senior officers attended in person or by communication link. She laid out the battle plan in 3 phases. First, long-range bombardment to thin enemy numbers. Second, surgical strikes against command nodes. Third, a direct assault on the central consciousness if the first 2 phases did not achieve victory. She told her officers that she would not lie to them. The odds were not good. They were outnumbered and many of them would not survive the battle, but she believed in them. She believed in human courage and human determination. She believed that when the moment came, they would do what needed to be done. Commander Brooks stood and raised his glass. He offered a toast to the fleet. He said that generations of humans had fought against impossible odds and won. He said that their ancestors were watching from somewhere beyond the stars, waiting to see if they were worthy of the name they carried. He said they would not disappoint. The officers drank together one last time. Then they returned to their posts and waited for the enemy to come. Outside, the stars remained cold and silent, but somewhere in that darkness, the swarm was moving, and in a matter of hours, the silence would end. The swarm arrived at dawn. Not that dawn meant anything in space, but they measured their days by the light of their sun, and their sun was just rising over the when the enemy appeared. Thousands of emerged from the darkness like a plague spreading across the sky. Admiral stood on the bridge of the Valiant and watched the enemy fleet approach. There were hideous things, twisted masses of flesh and bone that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. They moved in perfect coordination, a single mind controlling countless bodies. Sensors counted them as they came. 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 ships and still more emerging from behind moons and asteroid fields. She gave the order to begin Phase 1. Human battleships opened fire with their main cannons, sending streams of energy into the approaching mass. Explosions bloomed across the swarm formation, died by the dozens, but for every one destroyed, 10 more took its place. Commander Daniel Brooks coordinated the defensive formations from his tactical station. He directed ships to cover each other, creating overlapping fields of fire that tore holes in the enemy advance. Human gunners worked with mechanical precision, targeting the largest and reducing them to drifting husks. The swarm adapted quickly. They stopped approaching in a simple wave and began using spiral patterns that made them harder to hit. Brooks adjusted the fleet response within seconds. Human ships shifted position and continued firing. The gunners adjusted their aim and kept killing. The first swarm ships reached weapons range and returned fire. Acidic projectiles streaked across space and struck human hulls. The new coating held. Where unprotected ships would have melted away, human vessels shrugged off the attacks and kept fighting. Lieutenant Price monitored enemy communications from her station. She tracked the command node frequencies and fed targeting data to the strike teams waiting to launch. Her voice remained calm even as the ship shook from enemy impacts. She had a job to do, and nothing would stop her from doing it. Phase 2 began an hour into the battle. Captain Cole led 12 destroyers in a high-speed run toward the heart of the swarm formation. They burned their engines hard, pushing past safe limits to gain the speed they needed. Tried to intercept them, but the destroyers were too fast. Cole reached the first command node and gave the order to fire. Concentrated weapons fire tore into the massive. It tried to regenerate, but the damage was too severe. The command node exploded, and a section of the swarm suddenly lost coordination. In that cluster began drifting aimlessly, crashing into each other. The strike force did not stop to celebrate. They pushed deeper into enemy territory and hit a second command node, then a third. Each success threw more of the swarm into chaos. The human fleet exploited these openings, pouring fire into the disorganized clusters. But the central consciousness was learning. It began creating new command nodes faster than Cole could destroy them. Fresh emerged from the main mass and took over coordination duties. The swarm was hurt but not broken. Captain Cole reported the situation to Admiral. His voice was steady despite the danger surrounding his small force. He told her that they had done everything they could, but the enemy was adapting too quickly. Phase 2 was not going to win this battle. Had expected this possibility. She made the decision instantly. Phase 3 would begin immediately. The Valiant would lead a direct assault on the central consciousness. The flagship surged forward into the heart of the enemy fleet. Other human ships formed up around it, creating a protective formation. They pushed through walls taking damage from every direction. Hull breaches opened and crew members died at their posts. Doctor worked frantically in the medical bay. Wounded sailors arrived faster than she could treat them. Burns and acid injuries and impact trauma. She prioritized by severity and did her best to save everyone she could. Her hands were steady even when her heart was breaking. Chief Engineer Samuel Turner fought to keep the Valiant operational. Systems failed and he rerouted power. Conduits exploded and he patched them. The engine room became a nightmare of sparks and smoke, but Turner refused to abandon his station. He shouted orders to his team and they obeyed without hesitation. The Valiant reached the central consciousness after what felt like hours of brutal fighting. The massive loomed before them, a living mountain of flesh the size of a small moon. It pulsed with dark energy and radiated malevolence that could be felt through the hull. Weapons fire barely scratched its surface. The central consciousness was protected by layer after layer of regenerating tissue. Admiral realized that they could pound it for days and never break through. Commander Brooks reported that conventional weapons were ineffective. They needed another approach, asked if boarding was possible. Brooks checked the tactical displays. There were openings in the organism's surface, entry points that looked like wounds or perhaps mouths. A boarding party could potentially enter the creature and reach its core, but the chances of survival inside an active hive mind were essentially zero. Called for volunteers, every Marine on the ship stepped forward. Sergeant Hart organized them into assault teams and began distributing heavy weapons and environmental suits. They knew they were probably going to die. They suited up anyway. The Valiant maneuvered close to one of the entry points. Enemy fire intensified as if the swarm knew what the humans were planning. More systems failed. More crew members fell. But the ship held position long enough for the assault shuttles to launch. 4 shuttles carrying 60 Marines flew into the mouth of the beast. They disappeared inside the central consciousness, and the Valiant lost contact with them. All Admiral could do was wait and hope. Outside, the battle continued to rage. Human ships were dying. Ships were dying. The swarm was taking losses but seemed endless. Everything now depended on the Marines inside the central consciousness. Admiral gripped the arms of her command chair and watched the monstrous. Somewhere inside that nightmare, her people were fighting. Somewhere inside, the fate of the galaxy was being decided. She whispered a prayer to whatever might be listening. Then she ordered her remaining ships to keep fighting. As long as they drew breath, they would not give up. The inside of the central consciousness was a horror beyond imagination. Sergeant Hart led his Marines through corridors made of living tissue. The walls pulsed with strange rhythms. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of something ancient and terrible. Dim bioluminescent light came from everywhere and nowhere. Lieutenant Price had insisted on joining the assault team. Her knowledge of swarm communication patterns could help them find the core. She walked near the front of the formation, her eyes fixed on a handheld scanner that tracked the strongest signal concentrations. The first attack came without warning. Creatures burst from the walls, things that were all teeth and claws and fury. The Marines opened fire with their heavy weapons. Energy bolts tore through alien flesh. Bodies fell and dissolved into the floor. More creatures came. They crawled from openings in the ceiling and rose from pools of fluid on the ground. The Marines formed a defensive circle and kept shooting. Sergeant Hart shouted orders while firing his own weapon. They could not stop moving. If they stopped, they would be overwhelmed. Pointed toward a passage that glowed brighter than the others. The neural activity was strongest in that direction. The core had to be close. They pushed forward through the nightmare. Marines fell along the way. A man named Carlos took a claw strike to the chest and went down. A woman named was pulled into the wall by tentacles before anyone could reach her. Each death was a wound to those who survived. They kept moving anyway. Commander Daniel Brooks joined the assault team during the second wave of attacks. He had come down in a later shuttle when he realized the first teams were taking heavy losses. His presence steadied the remaining Marines. They trusted him to lead them through. The passage widened into a massive chamber. In the center floated the neural core, a pulsing mass of tissue the size of a house. Thousands of nerve tendrils connected it to the walls and ceiling. The entire swarm was controlled from this single point. If they destroyed it, the hive mind would die. But the core was guarded. Creatures unlike anything they had seen before stood between the Marines and their target. These were larger and more heavily armored. They moved with terrible purpose. Sergeant Hart gave the order to engage. The final battle began. Marines fought hand-to-hand with the Guardians. Human fists and boots and blades met alien claws and teeth. People died screaming. Creatures died in silence. The floor became slick with mixed blood. Commander Brooks reached the neural core while his people held off the Guardians. He planted explosive charges at key points where the tendrils connected. His hands were steady despite the chaos around him. He had trained for moments like this his entire career. Provided cover fire while Brooks worked. She was not a soldier, but she knew how to shoot. Every creature that came near the commander received a burst of energy that put it down. The charges were set. Brooks activated the timer. They had 90 seconds to get clear. The Marines began fighting their way back toward the entrance. Creatures pressed them from every direction. More people fell. Sergeant Hart took a wound to his leg but kept moving, supported by the Marines beside him. Stumbled over something and fell. A Guardian loomed over her, ready to strike. Commander Brooks appeared from nowhere and put himself between her and the creature. He killed it with 3 precise shots. They ran, 60 seconds remaining. The corridors seemed to stretch forever. The living walls began to shake as if the central consciousness realized what was happening. New creatures emerged from everywhere, desperate to stop the invaders. 40 seconds. Brooks could see light ahead. The entrance was close. He shouted for everyone to move faster. 20 seconds. The surviving Marines burst out of the central consciousness and threw themselves toward the waiting shuttles. Behind them, the neural core exploded. The effect was immediate and devastating. The central consciousness shuddered and began to die. Throughout the swarm fleet suddenly lost coordination. Some shut down completely. Others went insane, attacking everything around them, including each other. Admiral watched from the bridge of the Valiant as the enemy collapsed into chaos. The massive that housed the central consciousness began breaking apart, splitting into pieces that drifted through space like the corpse of a god. She gave the order to press the attack. Human ships advanced into the dying swarm and finished what the Marines had started. That still showed signs of activity were destroyed. Clusters that tried to regroup were scattered. The battle turned into a slaughter. The watched in disbelief. Ambassador stood beside Admiral and had no words for what was happening. A threat that had destroyed 7 civilizations was being dismantled by a species the galaxy had dismissed as primitive brutes. The battle ended 4 hours after the neural core exploded. The swarm was effectively annihilated. Scattered survivors fled into deep space where they would pose no threat to anyone. The cost of victory was severe. Half the human fleet was destroyed or heavily damaged. Thousands of crew members had died. The USS Valiant was barely functional, but the mission was accomplished. Prime was saved. Commander Brooks helped the surviving Marines back to the medical bay. Out of 60 who had entered the central consciousness, only 18 walked out. He memorized the name of every person who had not survived. They deserved to be remembered. Doctor worked for 16 hours straight treating the wounded. She saved lives that should not have been saved. When she finally collapsed from exhaustion, her staff carried her to a bed and let her sleep. Chief Engineer Turner somehow kept the Valiant from falling apart long enough to reach a repair station. He would later say that the ship held together through pure stubbornness. Admiral met with Ambassador one final time before the fleet began its journey home. They offered eternal gratitude and friendship. They offered treaties and trade agreements and technology sharing. But most of all, they offered a question. How did humans do it? How did they fight through impossible odds and refuse to die? Thought about her answer for a long moment. Then she told the ambassador that humans came from a world that tried to kill them every day. They evolved fighting for survival against predators and plagues and each other. They learned that the only way to live was to never give up, no matter how bad things seemed. Surrender was not in their nature. They would share this story across the galaxy. Species that had feared humans as dangerous monsters began to see them differently. They were not mindless brutes. They were protectors. They were allies worth having. They were hope in the darkness. The first expeditionary fleet limped home under the light of unfamiliar stars. Their ships were broken, and their numbers were fewer than when they left. But their spirits were unbroken. They had answered a call for help and done what needed to be done. Admiral recorded her final log entry as they approached Earth orbit. She spoke of sacrifice and courage and the bonds between species. She spoke of loss and grief and the price of doing right. And she spoke of pride. Pride in her crew, pride in her fleet, pride in being human. The stars no longer seemed so cold and distant. Somewhere out there, new friends were looking up at the same sky, and they knew that if darkness ever came again, they would answer. They always did.